I don't have to do that. I'm magically wired. Yeah. Thank you, Jimmy. Yeah, we had a great time yesterday. Hope we'll have a great time today. We had a good group, and as Jimmy said, I shouldn't say this because I'm one of the speakers. We had a great set of speakers. Covered some topics. I always like coming to a conference where I actually get to hear something a little bit new and learn something. And yesterday was one of those for me. So that was great. As Jimmy said, I am a UK graduate. I was there from 1978 to 1980. Did my graduate work there. And my major professor was Chuck Doherty, who came from New Zealand. And so I have weird and twisted views about a lot of things in farming practices and agriculture because I worked with Chuck Doherty. I was his first American graduate student. We had a little bit of a language barrier to, get through, but we were able to sort it out. And I probably would not have, been on the career path that I went had it not been for being at UK and having Chuck Doherty as my advisor there. So one of the things that I started out doing research in Missouri, and when I came to the faculty at Missouri, my assignment was basically make beef cattle competitive with soybeans on marginal farmland in North Missouri, because there were two really bad soil erosion places in the United States that were, building the state of Louisiana. Tennessee and Missouri are the two states that made Louisiana bigger because of all the soil erosion we sent down the rivers. So that was my assignment, make beef cattle competitive with soybeans. Any of you who had been through the cattle cycle of the 1970s went from, in 1973, we had the highest cattle prices ever, and then by a year later, in 1974, we had the most precipitous drop in cattle prices, ever recorded as part of a cattle cycle. People knew you can't rely on what the price is to be profitable. And nobody wanted to really run more cattle, because what causes the cattle cycle is when we get too many cattle. And so the one thing that we were left with was reduce costs. I did not grow up in the cattle business. I grew up a flatland Illinois crop farmer with hogs. I didn't know anything about cattle. But that's what my assignment was, make cattle competitive with soybeans. All right, so I figured the only way we can do that is reducing costs. And so literally, I looked at the cow-calf budget that the beef extension people provided to me and said, where can we make a difference? And when you look at a budget and the biggest single line item on there is feed costs, and specifically winter feed costs, it makes sense to tackle that big dollar item. So the whole program in controlled grazing and what we eventually started calling management intensive grazing in Missouri started as a winter grazing program to better utilize stockpiled fescue. The fact that we started managing with daily rotations and very intensive management in the summertime was only because we needed to manage better in the summer so that we could provide more acres of stockpiled feed in the winter. So our whole research program in Missouri that ultimately also created the Grazing School program, all that, it all started from the standpoint of how can we more effectively use stockpiled fescue. And that brings us to kick the hay habit. Why you should be out of the hay business. Now there's a subtitle on this, and it might be a little less relevant over here than what it was between Cincinnati and Lexington. Why you should be out of the hay business if you are really in the livestock business. Now, if you can produce horse hay and sell it to horsey people at $350, $500 a ton, whatever it happens to be, there's people, alfalfa hay producers in Idaho, who ship hay to Florida for racehorses down there it goes on the truck priced at $500 a ton, and then there's $400 a ton transportation cost to get it from Idaho to Florida. I don't understand the logic nor the finances of that, but it's what people do. And so if you can produce hay and sell it at a true profit, I'm not telling you to get out of that hay business. I'm telling you that if you're really in the livestock business, you probably ought to be out of the hay making business. So I always start at this point here. Minnesota, Missouri, Mississippi, based on actual producer records, those people all feed approximately the same amount of hay from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico. And in Missouri, I know many, many producers who feed no hay at all. They do graze year-round. It is, to me, it's the garden spot of grazing in the world. And I live in Idaho now. I moved to Idaho as a recreational lifestyle move. If my life's ambition were to be in the cow business, I never ever would have left Missouri. So if there's people who feed no hay in Missouri, if you believe in normal distribution, for every producer that doesn't feed any hay, and if the average is 130, there's producers who feed hay for 260 days. And you know what? There are. I knew some of those people. And that flat doesn't work. But there we are, down through the center part of the country, Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, everybody's feeding the same amount of hay. Why would that possibly be? How do you get to that situation? And the answer is right there. We made hay making so easy that it no longer became a burden. Go back 200 years and think, how did you make hay? Rake, pitch. You know, it took 6 families, each one with 9 kids getting together, 42 horses, to put up the hay crop. It was a big deal. It was hard work. I always like to ask this one, and every once in a while I will meet someone who remembers. There's a few people here even older than me. In the 1970s, what was Vermeer's marketing slogan? Anybody remember? The one-man hay system. That's how easy we made it. The one-man hay system, all right? And actually, it was shockingly cheap. In 1973, my dad bought, I used to say it was the first Vermeer 605C baler in Illinois. Turns out it wasn't, but it was one of the first. That baler cost $4,200, okay? Basically, that was my high school graduation present. We had been doing square bale, little square bale custom baling for several years, and then we got the big baler. I paid for my first 4 years of college, some travel around the country, all from custom haying. We paid for all the equipment. My dad got his cut of the action. I paid for my college education this way. It was a lucrative deal. Something else that happened in 1973, we had that record high cattle price, $54 a hundredweight. In inflation-adjusted dollars, that is still the highest beef price we have ever had in the United States of America. That 178 that we hit in 2014 as nominal dollars, or that, oh wow, $178, that was only in inflation-adjusted dollars, that was roughly 2/3 of what the beef price was in 1973. We had the Housewife's beef boycott. We had President Nixon cap beef prices. We had President Nixon stop any beef export out of the United States. You young people don't know that. Some of you older guys and gals might remember that. That was the state of the beef industry in 1973. And by 1974, 1 year later in July, we were at about 20 cents is what fed cattle was. It fell from 54 to 20 cents in that short period of time. All right, let's fast forward 40 years. And I used 1973 to 2013 because it's a perfect 40-year span, okay? about 40 years of age is when the typical farmer actually comes into control of his or her own operation. So even though we talk about a generation being 25 years in general society, in the farming community, a generation is more like 40 years. All right. So it's 40 years. And in 73, we had what at that moment was a record high price of $148. And then in 2014, it of course went higher. But then I'd have to be using 41 years, and damn, the math's a whole lot harder when you do 41 years instead of 40 years. All right, so we were at $148 fed cattle price. 605M baler, not the souped up fanciest model, but a basic M-series baler. And if you knew the dealer and could get a little bit of a deal, you could buy that for about $40,000. Well, that's a tenfold increase in the cost of the baler, isn't it? And not quite 2.5 times increase in the value of beef. Let's put that all in a table and compare some things between 1973 and 2013. The cost of our baler went up 950%. Something else that happened in 1973 was the first OPEC oil embargo. And fuel prices and fertilizer prices skyrocketed through 1973 into the mid-70s and on up. When we started baling hay in May of 1973, we were paying 17 cents a gallon for diesel fuel. In 2013, it was $3.46. Now, it's come back down, but that 40-year horizon, 2,000% increase in the cost of fuel, 800 to 1,000% increase in labor costs, 700% cost in increase of fertilizer. Now, fertilizers come back down, and it's actually almost exactly where it should be based on just inflation. We were charging $6 a bale for custom baling in 1973. Looking at custom grazing charts from all across the country, in about 2013, $9 to $12 a bale. That's not much of an increase for that poor guy who's trying to custom bale hay. That's only 1.5 to 2 times the price that it was 40 years ago. And then we look at that fed cattle price, 275%. You kind of get the drift. Inputs have increased way, way more than the value of our product. There's a thing called inflation. You expect prices to go up over time. There's a general inflation rate through the economy. Some commodities and products increase faster than the general rate of inflation. Some go more slowly. This next table adjusts for inflation. I want to start with the bottom line. If the only thing that were working in the economy was that general inflation rate, what fed cattle should be worth right now is $284 a hundredweight. You know what they are right now? About 110. The input costs are everything other than that nitrogen fertilizer, because that's almost exactly what nitrogen fertilizer is today. Everything else, though, the input costs are way higher than what they should be if only basic inflation was working. Our products, the guy doing custom baling, $31.50 is what you, the farmer, should be paying the custom guy to roll up a bale of hay right now. Would any of you pay $31.50 to have your neighbor bale a bale of hay for you? I doubt it. Would all of you love to have beef cattle, fed cattle worth $284 a hundredweight? Absolutely. Again, input costs have increased exponentially compared to the value of our product. Farming practices that worked in 1973 do not work today for that very reason. Okay, so that's the starting premise. Let's think about what it costs to make hay. There's some pretty obvious costs because they're the ones that you write a check for. You buy fertilizer, you put it on the field so that you can grow more hay. That's going to cost you money. This is what on average is in a ton of hay. 40 to 60 pounds of nitrogen, 6 pounds of phosphorus, which is 13 pounds of phosphate fertilizer equivalent, 30 to 50 pounds of potassium, so about 45 pounds of potash. That's what's in a ton of hay. That costs money. If you bale hay up, ship it off, and that shipping off might be just feeding it somewhere else on your property, or it might be selling it off your property. You are selling that much fertility off of your place. You can buy the fertilizer and replace it and maintain productivity, or you can keep mining those minerals out of the soil, not replace anything, and over time productivity is going to go down and feed quality is going to go down. So I think everybody needs to know, what does it actually cost you to make hay? Now, I'm a spreadsheet geek, and so I put everything into spreadsheets and put in lines where you plug all that stuff in. So right now we're looking at a farm that puts up 300 acres of hay, has a yield of 4 tons to the acre. They're cutting twice, big round bales, so they're producing about 1,200 tons of hay. And over here it summarizes what the cost per acre, cost per ton, cost per bale, cost per pound of feed is. So the only thing that we have done so far is put on fertilizer, and we're not even doing the nitrogen. We're putting on phosphorus and potassium at the rate that it is being removed, and we're putting on a little bit of micronutrients, maybe sulfur, maybe boron. I don't know what you're doing, but it is not at a replacement rate. It's just kind of a token. Well, we got to put on some micronutrients. And where we're standing right now is $22 per ton in that hay, just as P and K and a few micronutrients. That's a grass legume mixture. That's why we didn't put nitrogen on. So we're going to put nitrogen on it now. And the cost, we're putting on the full replacement rate. So we're not giving any credit to any biologically available organic matter nitrogen. We're putting the full requirement to grow 4 tons of hay back on. And we're now at $44 a ton in fertility cost. And I haven't looked at the zinc, the cobalt, the copper, any of those other things that we know we want to have in our livestock mineral mix, because animals need to have that. And if it is not in our forage, we're going to have to pay for it through buying a mineral supplement. So if we take the full the fertilizer cost of what we normally do as fertilizer and the livestock mineral cost of the other contents of that hay, we will see that there's $50 to $55 worth of nitrogen and minerals in a ton of hay right now. We have a harvesting cost. What's involved with harvesting? Well, everything, it doesn't matter what color it is or how new it is going to break down. We have repairs on it. We can do maintenance work, change the fluids, change the oil, do the things that need to be done. That's an ongoing cost. We have fuel. All of this stuff runs on petroleum. So, some of you may remember when diesel fuel cost a little bit more. 2007, 2008, we had the highest fuel prices that we've experienced. National average diesel fuel, 07, 08, $4.71. Now, where I live in central Idaho now, anything we get has to come over a mountain pass. And so everything costs a little more when you do that. At Salmon, Idaho, at that same time, $5.40 is what diesel fuel was costing us. Well, it's down to only, $2.50 or something now. Everybody believe it's going to stay there for the rest of your life, or maybe it'll just keep getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. I kind of doubt it. It's going to go back up again sometime. You have no control over what the price of fuel is. We don't know where it's going to go. I always say, one bad day in the Middle East or one really well-targeted hurricane in the Gulf, and we could very easily, in a month's time, be looking at $3.50 diesel fuel again. We have no control. That twiner wrap, what's that made out of? For the most part, it's a petroleum product. So we use a whole lot of stuff in our industry that is related to petroleum, over which we have no control. And then we have labor. Farm labor is harder and harder and harder to come by. We keep having to pay them a little bit more. And again, we see from 1973 to 2013, we saw that almost 1,000% increase in labor costs. So the way that I have harvesting costs figured here, these are typical or average custom farming costs. I could not find specific numbers for Kentucky, so these are the Indiana, Ohio numbers averaged from the Indiana worksheet, I think, was from 2018, and the Ohio was the 2019. So these were current costs. And I'll tell you, these are lower costs than almost everything we see in the western states. So I was a little surprised it wasn't any more than this. I did take so there's the total cost per acre, and we're doing 4 tons, so that tells you it's about $32 a ton in harvesting cost. We are generally figuring around $42 per ton harvest cost in the western states. So, and on the fertilizer, I have taken the nitrogen back out because I'm a strong advocate of grass legume mixtures, not grass monocultures. So we had the $22 PK and minimal micronutrient fertilizer cost, add $32 to it for the harvest cost. We're at $54 a ton just for fertilizer and harvest operations. I still have people who tell me, I put up a ton of hay for $30. No, you don't. True cost accounting, there's nobody who can do that. Equipment depreciation. This is a killer cost on smaller farms because most smaller farms are overcapitalized in equipment. Dr. Halich, Greg Halich, is going to talk about this later. He's done his analysis, and he'll talk about that later. I do consulting work with ranches, farms and ranches all across the U.S. Most of my business is in the western U.S., and I work with some sizable operations. Our biggest client is a 14,000 beef cow operation, and we work with a lot of 1,000 to 6,000 cow operations. And in analysis I do in the West, I basically figure you have to have a minimum of 600 cows before you can justify owning a piece of hay equipment. 600 cows. I'm sure there's nobody in this room who has a small number of cows and farming equipment, but some of your neighbors, I bet, have 26 cows, 2 tractors, a mower conditioner, a Vermeer twin rake, and a big round baler, and a bale trailer to haul it out of the field. Your neighbor, you might have neighbors that are that type of an operation. It is unsustainable. Later on it'll actually be on a slide, but I'll say it now because it doesn't hurt to hear it multiple times. I think it is more important to stop making hay with your own equipment on your own property than it is to stop feeding hay. If you are a small to medium-sized operation, I think you're far better off to use a custom operator and have your hay put up by a custom operator than it is to own the equipment and do it yourself. And it's because you take away the ownership cost. You do have to have a certain scale, a certain number of animals to justify the cost of owning that equipment. And a lot of your neighbors just are not at that point. Now, I said I use the average custom farming cost. Most of the states, who have the tables for custom farming costs will have the typical cost and the custom farming cost. A custom farmer is somebody who may not own an acre of land, may not grow an acre of their own crops. All they do is custom farm, which means that their custom farming operation has to pay for the equipment also. And if you look at those columns, very often that custom farming cost will be 30 to 40% higher than the typical. Why is that? Because they're paying for the equipment also. Most people don't factor that in, but every one of these items costs money. They all depreciate, and for some people, they think depreciation is just something your tax accountant does to, save you a little money with IRS. But in reality, everything wears out. Ultimately, everything has to be replaced, and that's what true depreciation is. And you can maintain a tax depreciation rate schedule on everything you own, and then you can do the realistic farming one. And, 7 years depreciation, almost all of us have equipment that's way older than 7 years. So you can look at it on 10 years, 15 years, whatever you actually think reality is, but it has to be accounted for at some point. Now, in this particular operation, I will put together an equipment fleet. If I'm working with an actual client, we use their actual equipment list and we do a depreciation schedule on it. But for something like this, I figure what size tractor, what size equipment do I need to do 300 acres? I go to Fastline, and because you can do that for any region of the country. I'll go to Fastline for the Midwest, find what good quality used equipment is selling for. I never price things out at new equipment prices, but I don't want to have junk either. So that's how we put together a budget for what the equipment is. And on this particular one, the equipment ownership cost was $51 an acre, which makes about $12 a ton because we're producing 4 tons to the acre. So now we're at $67 on that cost per ton. Something a lot of people don't think about is what we call stand depreciation. Now, if you've got an old hillside of infected Kentucky 31 that's been there for 60 years and you don't even overseed clover on it or anything, guess what? You don't have a stand depreciation cost. But if you're growing alfalfa orchard grass hay and replacing that stand every 5 or 6 years, you have a cost, something that every 5 or 6 years you're paying to replace that field. And what do we have? We have a tillage cost. We're going to put some lime on. We have fertility that we're going to add back in there. And then we have seed and we have seeding. And if you're putting in a good improved variety of grass, a good improved variety of alfalfa, and you're taking proper care of liming the soil and all those things, it is really hard to do it for less than $200 to $250 an acre for the full cost of replacing a stand. So I've got an alfalfa mix with a 5-year stand life, and anything like that, I'm charging interest on. And right now, 4 3/4% is what I'm typically using as operating interest cost on something like that. We have made an investment for 5 years. If you were to buy a treasury bond and you were planning to redeem it in 5 years, don't you expect to get interest on it? Anything else that you invest in, don't you expect to earn a dividend or interest on it? So if you invest in seeding a field for 5 years, you got to get interest money on that. So with interest, it's $52. So that's $13 a ton going on. So we're now up to $80 a ton for fertilizer, harvesting operations, equipment cost, and stand depreciation. Those are the big costs that you're likely to incur. $80 a ton. Yesterday in the session, people were talking and saying that they could buy a 1,400-pound roll of hay for $30, $35 most years. Now, you get a bad year, either drought or excessive rain, and it doesn't get rained on, or it gets the crop doesn't grow, or it gets rained on. Prices go up, but they come back down. But if you could buy a ton of hay for $50 a ton rather than investing $80 a ton in producing it, what makes more sense? Buying that hay. Now we're going to look at some other costs that a lot of people don't think about. One is the land itself. Is your land free? Well, I own it free and clear. I mean, great-granddaddy paid for this in 1912. I don't know anything on it. I don't know what land sells for over here. I heard horrendous prices over in North Kentucky. You always have what we call an opportunity cost. And once again, opportunity costs aren't something that economists just make up to make you feel bad about making lousy choices. Opportunity cost is what you are giving up in order to do what you've chosen to do. That land, see, the way we work in the ranching world is there's a land holding company and there's a ranch operations company. And ranch operations pays a lease to the land holding company. That's how you manage your expenses. There's very few places in the country that you can buy an acre of land and pay for it just from farming, because it isn't the ag productive capacity of the land that dictates the price. It's the recreational value, the scenic value, the development value. So we think there always has to be a land charge. Now, I'm not necessarily going to insist you put it there, because whether you graze that land, whether you hay it, whether you grow corn on it, you got that land cost. But we're going to put it in here just to, crank the numbers up even more. And I've got a $45 per acre rental rate in there. So that's $11 a ton. So we're at $91 with a return to the land factored in there. Now, just to make you people feel good about the rain out here, in the West, we have to irrigate. So I moved from Missouri, where we had a 38-inch annual rainfall, to Patterson, Idaho, where we have slightly less than 8 inches total as our annual rainfall. So if you're going to grow a hay crop or something, you irrigate. So we have that irrigation cost that goes on there, and that's why Western hay almost always is going to cost more than Eastern hay. I put $80 an acre in there. We run center pivots, and when we have a 300-acre pivot and a 150-acre pivot. That 300-acre pivot runs at 2,400 gallons a minute. And you say, man, that must cost a fortune to pump. We don't pump water. We are gravity pressurized because we live at the foot of a mountain. Our irrigation cost is only about $40 an acre. You go out on the plains where they're pumping out of the Ogallala Aquifer that every year is getting lower, lower, lower. We've got plenty of clients that have $200 to $300 per acre irrigation cost. So this 80 is conservative, I guess, but that puts it at 111. We're going to kick that out of there again. All right, so this is what I said. It's more important to stop making hay, and I'll emphasize, with your own equipment on your place than it is to stop feeding hay. Now, I'll also say it just this way. It's more important to stop making hay, period, than it is to stop feeding hay, and it's going to be because of some other things that we're going to bring into play now. One is breaking the nutrient cycle. So when we make hay, cut it here, feed it somewhere else, 80% of the nitrogen and minerals in the above portion of the plant, we are physically moving somewhere else. If you sold it off your property, it's gone forever. If you take it from your river bottom field, which is rich in nutrients, and feed it up here on the hillside because you said, I can feed hay from down here and not really hurt that soil and improve soil up here. If you are doing that, that's fine. That's, to me, a reasonably solid approach to nutrient management within the farm. All right. But 80% of the nutrients are being moved from where you harvest them. So, I said, this is what's in a ton of hay. If you multiply that by 3, We've got what's in 3 tons of hay. We also have the sulfur, magnesium, zinc, copper, cobalt, all those other things. And that's where that $50 to $55 nutrient value in a ton of hay comes from. It's the full spectrum of every mineral and nitrogen that's in there. All right, so here's 3 tons of hay. The reason I use 3 tons is because I go a lot of places in the country and say, hey, what's your hay yield? Oh, it's about 3 tons to the acre. The other reason I use it is if we had that field growing 3 tons of hay, grazed it effectively with stockers, gaining about 1 3/4 pounds a day, we would produce 500 pounds of beef gain from that same field. You remember these numbers here, 150 pounds of nitrogen, 39 phosphate, 150 potash. Let's think about grazing it. We are not taking the whole plant and moving it off of that field. The animal is eating it, processing it, and over 90% of every mineral that the animal consumes from plants comes out the back end. So they're putting it back out on the field. The question is how uniformly and consistently are they doing that? But what walks off the field as animal body weight gain, this is what is in this is what's in 500 pounds of beef gain, 16 pounds of nitrogen. So roughly just over 10% of what the hay crop removes is what a grazing animal removes. 11 pounds of phosphate. So a little more than 25% of what a hay crop removes, the animal removes. Potassium, less than 1% of what the hay crop removes, the animal removes. Potassium is an essential element. We need to eat it every day. Animals need to eat it every day. It's very important in blood pressure regulation, cell osmotic pressure, stuff like that, but it's a flow through. It's not like you accumulate it in your bones like you do phosphorus. You don't build it into your muscles like you do nitrogen, which is the foundation of protein. It's just flowing through the animal. In the eastern half of the country, maintaining high potassium levels in alfalfa fields and clover pastures is important to the persistence and performance of that legume. And that's why in a hay crop, you got to put that potassium back on an ongoing basis. But in a pasture, we rarely ever have a potassium deficiency because the cows are just peeing it right back out on the ground. How about the opportunity cost of your land? If you weren't making hay on that land, what might you do? All right, let's think about being in a cow-calf operation, and we have to have that hay to feed to our cows. If we plug in our production cost at $90 a ton, 3 ton per acre yield incurs a cost against my cow operation of $270 an acre. That is a cost to my cow operation. There's no other way that I can see. Now, I'm a biologist, not an economist. Dr. Halich might, have a different eye on it, but to me, that is incurring a cost against my cow operation. If I chose instead to custom graze stockers on that hay field rather than grazing, if I can produce 500 pounds of beef and I'm getting 40 cents a pound of gain, that's an income of $200 an acre. It is an added revenue stream. Custom grazed pears, I don't know what the rate is here. In our neighborhood, it's about $35 per AUM, animal unit month. So that's $245 acre income. I would rather have an income stream from my land than a cost from my land. Okay? Pretty simple point of view that I have there. All right, so, but I need hay. Well, I can use some of that income to buy the hay. I have eliminated, if I'm not making hay and I don't have to have the equipment, I can completely eliminate that overhead cost. Again, it's more important to stop making hay than it is to stop feeding hay. All right, so how do you make that work? This is what we did in Missouri. This is how we went from a kind of conventional operation of making a lot of hay in the spring and feeding a lot of hay in the winter to year-round grazing and not making any hay. And if we did need to feed any hay, which ended up, our last year's there was about 2 weeks of the year is what we would feed hay. We bought that hay. But the key thing is we considered cow-calf to be our centerpiece enterprise, but we based the size of our cow herd on our winter grazing capacity, not our summer grazing capacity. If you stock for your summer grazing capacity, you've pretty well guaranteed that you're going to have excess growth in the spring and nothing to graze in the winter. And so that's what we had to change. We added the spring flush of growth that normally, or in the past, that we had cut for hay. We just started eating all of that with our custom grazing enterprises. And the way that worked, and the timing of it is very important, about 60% of the total forage we produced on our farm went to feed the cow herd. But remember, we're basing it on what our feed supply December, January, February is. And 40% of our forage production, that big bump in spring growth that you see in all those pictures of the growth curve, we ate it up with outside animals. We would generally get them on the property middle of April as we're starting to green up, and we would have them gone around early August, end of July, early August. And then where the contract animals had grazed April to August, you've probably heard some of your forage specialists or your ag agent here in Kentucky say, you should start stockpiling your tall fescue pastures in August. All right? So that's why we had the timing that we did. So when the contract animals left, those were the acres of the farm that grew to become our winter feed supply. Now, some people say, but you really had to cut back your stocking rate, didn't you? Well, how do you want to look at stocking rate? Just as the number of cows we carry or the total pounds of animal live weight we carry on the farm. And where we ended up is we actually ran a higher stocking rate in terms of total pounds of animals carried, or you could look at it as total animal unit days harvested off the farm. When we brought our cow herd down slightly, put in those contract grazing animals, at the end of every year, we had actually harvested more AUDs per acre from the place than when we were cutting hay in the spring and feeding hay in the winter. This is kind of, what I have learned, and I have worked in 43 of the 50 U.S. states. So I have kind of a wide perspective across the country of what's going on. And we have done analysis of hay cost on specific individual farms all across the country, and we have done a whole lot of them. Very rarely have I ever found anyone who was actually producing hay for less than $80 a ton. Everyone that I have found that's doing that is in the northern plains. North Dakota, South Dakota, far eastern Montana, little bit of northern Nebraska. That's the only place that I have found where people, no matter how I twist it and try to make it be over $80 a ton, where I find some people who are in the $55, $60, $65 a ton range in making hay. Very rare we see it under 80. A whole lot of commercial ranches, operating at scale to be profitable enterprises, it's generally around $100 to $120 a ton. I come to the eastern half of the country where we really find a lot of people overcapitalized in equipment, too much equipment for the number of cows that they have, very often over $150 a ton. I think my worst analysis I ever did was $260 a ton for beef cow hay. Now, this was a wealthy person who had a full line of brand new equipment for a 60 cow operation. And it was just ridiculous. When you buy hay, you buy fertility. I talk about all that stuff that's in there. When you buy hay from somebody else, bring it onto your property rather than exporting fertility out because you sold hay, you're bringing fertilizer in. said, there's a lot of good stuff in a bale of hay. A lot of value there. The key thing is, if you're going to import hay, you want to feed it out effectively to get those minerals spread around. 20 years ago, I was one of those guys from the university who would have told you that every bale needs to be fed in a ring feeder, otherwise you waste too much hay. But what I found is ring feeders concentrate nutrients. And so every place you have a bale with a ring feeder around it, you have tremendously enriched soil there. 40 feet away, you don't. 100 feet away, you don't. And so we like to very systematically feed hay out to get better manure distribution across the landscape. And is there some waste? Yes, there is. Is there some waste on most of these outdoor stored big bales? Yes, there is. And so better to have that rotting hay spread out across the field to contribute to fertility than just packed in at this ring feeder and they didn't eat it, and now you have a spot that nothing grows through for a couple of years because there's so much rotted hay there. The other thing we have is the opportunity cost of your time. What else could you be doing if you weren't making hay? All right, building fence. I can't take time to build fence. I have to mow hay. Moving electric fence every day to very effectively manage your pastures. Oh, I can't do that. I got hay to rake. Stock water developments so that you can subdivide your pastures and split up into smaller and smaller increments of time the pastures and how you manage them. I can't send my tractor to do that. I need that tractor to pull the baler. Monitoring pastures. What do you mean monitoring pastures? I mean going out and assessing how much feed you have, what is the quality and condition of the pastures, and making reasonable decisions about how to change your management to make your pastures better so you don't have to feed as much hay. Marketing your livestock rather than your marketing program being, well, we're going to wean calves this morning, throw them on the stock trailer and get them to the barn by 11 and they ought to sell before 4. If that's your marketing program, you're leaving a whole lot of money on the table. So why don't a lot of farmers do anything more about actually marketing and business management? Because they're too busy working in the business of mowing hay, raking hay, baling hay, stacking hay, and then feeding it out again. And then my favorite is the guy I saw at a winter meeting and said, yeah, I'm going to come to the grazing school this year. Grazing school comes, they're not there, you see them a little bit later on, and hey, I thought you were coming to the grazing school. I couldn't do that. You did that right in the middle of haying season. I hear that numerous times. And what about the idea of just taking some time off? Go on vacation. I can't go on vacation in the summer because I'm making hay. Well, I can't take a skiing vacation to Breckenridge. I got hay to feed. Yeah. Then you feed it back to them. That's occasionally what our Memorial Day will look like. I know you're back here in your shorts barbecuing. We can have, it's not uncommon for us in last week of May, first week of June, to have snow like this. If the grass has started growing, we don't worry about it and they just eat. If it's a really late spring and nothing's really growing out there, yeah, you might have to feed them on Memorial Day. And then you waste less of your time. Okay, so this is how we feed cows in the wintertime. You've stockpiled feed, or in some cases where swath grazing. I can feed 400 to 500 cows in a half an hour just by going out and moving the fence. 10 below, 20 below, no big deal. You just go out and move the fence. My neighbor, a lot of days in the winter, he can't get his tractor running and warmed up to the point where he can go out and feed, and I'm already done. It's like the little old ladies in the little town, seeing who's going to get their clothes out on the line first in the morning. I am an early riser, and I go out and feed, and I have cows fed and I could still hear the tractor cranking over there and, you know, some smoke rolling out of the barn. But no, I'm done before they get started. It's a lower cost. In most situations, you're going to find that the cost of feeding hay is substantially higher than the cost of grazing. There'll be a few occasions when that's not the case. The majority of our, again, operating at scale clients, there's going to be at least $1 per cow savings per day if they are grazing instead of hay feeding. We've seen times when it's approaching $2 a day, you know, depending on what the hay cost is. As I say, less labor required. This is the interesting thing. 50 cows, 100 cows, 500 cows, when you're feeding them this way, basically it takes the same amount of labor. And if you can feed 50 cows in a half an hour, you can feed 500 cows or 800 cows in a half an hour if you are grazing stockpiled feed. The more efficient nutrient cycle, we've talked about that, and then your cows don't become welfare bums. You know, when the first snowflake appears in the air, you start feeding your cows, that becomes their expectation, and that's what they're going to be waiting for. We have you know, even in Missouri, we routinely graze through 1 foot to 1.5 foot of snow. Now, when we got a snow like that in Missouri, very often in a week it was completely gone. In Idaho, we will have continuous snow cover for 3 or 4 months. And we don't graze all winter in the type of operation we are because we don't have cows there all winter. I've grazed to the end of January and into the month of January a number of times. Now we are generally done in November. And I'll tell you why that is. It's because we run more numbers in the summertime. Why do we run more numbers in the summertime? I think I said the ranch runs about 1,400 cows. 600 to 800 of those go out onto public range, BLM, or Forest Service. We lose 15 to 35 calves every year to wolves. And so if you send fewer cows up there, that's fewer that are going to get picked off by wolves. And so we've been upping the numbers of what we keep down on deeded land to avoid wolf predation in the mountains. And eventually, they'll probably go to no grazing up there. But that's why we did it. Okay, so I used to work for the University of Missouri. 17 years ago, almost 17 years ago, I walked away from one of those jobs where I got the paycheck the last day of the month, whether I did anything or not, you know, just like these guys. And I had to start working for a living, so I got to hustle every chance I get. So I do have books for sale back here. Now, I'll point out the Quality Pasture book. That's the newest book. It's a revision of what Alan Nation had done. And I made a tactical mistake of not bringing nearly enough of those. I sold out of Quality Pasture by the end of lunchtime yesterday. So what I've been doing, if you're interested in that book and you're buying something else, if you pay for it today, we'll ship it to you with no postage on it. But I am completely out of those ones. The others I have. Do we have any time for questions, Chris?
Yes.
All right. Any questions, comments? Yes, sir. Okay, good question. So, as I said, when we were in Missouri, you know, 1 foot to 1.5 foot snow didn't slow our cows down a bit, as long as we had done a proper job of planning the grazing season and we had stockpiled feed. Now, if you've got 3-inch tall bluegrass under 18 inches of snow, that cow's not going to go down to get that. If you have 1.5 tons to 2 tons of stockpiled fescue standing in the field, if those cows know that they're supposed to work for a living, that's not an impediment. I'll tell a little story there. It was in 1996, I think. I did a cross the Canadian provinces year-round grazing tour. Alan Nation was with me on that trip, a couple other people, and we were doing this in December, which is a crazy thing to do. to go to the Canadian prairies in December. We started in Brandon, Manitoba, and I said, yeah, our cows in Missouri, they'll graze through a foot of snow, no problem. Our cows here in Manitoba, they graze through 2 foot of snow, eh? And, well, that makes perfect sense. Canadian cows are huge. They get more snow. Of course their cows should graze through more snow. So that was fine. I believed it. We drove from Brandon, Manitoba to Saskatoon and got to Saskatoon. I'm doing my spiel. Missouri cows graze through a foot of snow. Manitoba cows through 2 foot of snow. Our cows here, they graze through 3 foot of snow, eh? What do they do in Saskatchewan? Some of you have probably heard of swath grazing. Some of you may not have. So swath grazing is where you take either perennial pasture, but more typically an annual forage, and at the end of the growing season, you mow it, rake it, put it into, big swaths. And some of their swaths are basically the size of one of these tables. Well, you get 3 feet of snow, and the top of the swath is still just a foot under the top of the snow. And so they go in there, you find a swath, and they graze it, and they do great. From Saskatoon, we went to Rocky Mountain House, Alberta, right on the foot of the Rockies out west of Calgary. And I said, yeah, Missouri cows, they graze through a foot of snow. Manitoba cows, 2 foot. Saskatchewan, 3 foot. One rancher put his hand up and said, my cows, they graze through 4 foot of snow, eh? And his neighbors testified that they were true. They don't water them. All their water in the winter they get just from consuming snow. Yes, the face of his cattle are scratched up bloody and raw from pushing through sagebrush and snow drifts and things, but that's how they winter. So a cow will do what it gets used to doing. In grazing in snow, the higher the stock density, and even in snow, we're moving every day, the higher stock density that they go in, the more they just start blowing the snow apart. So they do a better job. The higher the stock density, they'll clean up that area. If you just turn them loose in a field, they're going to bed and smash a lot of it down, not be able to use it. So wastage is higher if you do it very lax. This is a long answer to the one question. Horses, horses paw and break snow. In the West, we have clients who they run 1 horse per 10 cows, and 1 horse will break enough crusted snow, 2 foot of snow, to open it up to feed 10 cows. And so that's the typical stocking rate. And I'm talking, 1,000 cows that they put 100 horses with to break snow. That's how seriously they take, I don't want to feed hay, as they do stuff like that. One last question. We'll do this one over here. How much mud? Okay. Mud is a far greater impediment to grazing than is snow or even ice. In Missouri, that was our greatest challenge, was mud. And it's increasingly becoming that way as the frost-free or frozen ground-free winters are creeping further and further and further north. The way we deal with mud is we accelerate the rate of movement. Sometimes in muddy conditions, I would move 2 or 3 times a day strip grazing. If it gets so bad, do we have NRCS people here? Anyone from NRCS? Yes, ma'am. Okay, there are programs in most of these kind of transition zone states for building, cost share programs for building solid footing. We don't want barns. I despise any time you put a beef cow inside, somebody's going to get sick. But if you can do a raised pad feeding area, and yeah, I don't like having to feed hay in confinement because then you got to haul manure back out. But if it's the difference between stomping a pasture to the point that it's not going to be productive this year or feeding in confinement and hauling manure out, you are going to end up overall being dollars ahead, feeding them in the confinement and hauling that manure back out. We better stop there.